Hello and welcome to the second installment of these Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup information videos. This video we're going to be talking about one of the more essential parts of the game, weapons. Every character should wield a weapon of some kind. There's no reason not to in most situations. And for the most part, you gain some benefit for doing so, even if you're not hitting anything with it. However, the question of what weapon to wield and how much to train in it is a very complicated one. For this reason, discussing this is going to take an entire video. And even after that is completed, the question of what weapon to use and how much to train in it may still not be entirely clear, but we'll do the best we can. So we need to ask ourselves, what is in a weapon? Well, there's quite a lot of things that influence what a weapon is and is capable of doing. Here's the description of a falchion that you can find when you select it in your inventory screen, and you can see there's quite a bit of information. So let's go through it a bit at a time and decide exactly what it is that all these bits of information mean. One of the first pieces of information is the accuracy rating of the weapon listed here. The accuracy rating helps you determine how likely you are to hit. It's used in a very complicated formula that uses the monster's evasion and shield rating, if they have any, to determine whether or not you hit them. Higher accuracy means you're more likely to hit. The effect of the accuracy rating coming from the weapon, however, is often crowded out by the much larger modifier found on your fighting and weapon, found as a result of your fighting and weapon skill, which is also a very complicated thing, so we won't get into the details. But again, having high fighting and weapon skill will increase your accuracy with the weapon to the point where the base accuracy kind of stops mattering all too much, so you really don't need to worry about it that much. However, if you're a new character or a character with a little skill in the weapon, with only a little skill in the weapon, then starting with a weapon with a high accuracy rating can be helpful. This is why it's good to start with the smaller, lower end weapons, like hand axes as opposed to executioner axes, when you're training up a new skill or anything like that. It's also why weapons like, say, the quarterstaff are good starting weapons for characters just getting used to melee for the first time because of their very high accuracy rating. Though there are other components as to why these are good starting weapons, and we'll get into those later. Next category is the one listed here. I'm not going in sequential order, as you can see. That's because I want to sort of discuss this. I want to leave the most important aspects to the end, because they're going to take a long time to explain. Next part is the weapon category. All weapons are grouped into a number of different categories. The categories are axes, polearms, maces and flails, short blades, long blades, staves, bows, crossbows, slings, and, well, you can count throwing as a category as well, I suppose, but it's not quite the same. And all the melee weapon categories, anyway, are all quite good choices if you're worried about melee combat. So you can't really go wrong by choosing any particular one, though they do have relative strengths and weaknesses, and certain races are better with certain weapons than others. And it's also important to note that certain weapon categories are better with shields than others. So it can be difficult to determine exactly which one you want to choose, but ultimately you can't really go too far astray by picking any particular category type. The handedness of the weapon is also important. It determines how many hands are required to wield the weapon. As you can see, this falchion is one-handed, and a one-handed weapon receives only a very small penalty when used in conjunction with a shield. This can be very helpful. The penalty is also completely eliminated given sufficient shield skill. One-handed weapons are also similar to slings. Slings are very useful when using a shield. weapon can also be 1.5-handed. This comes from the historical notion of a bastard sword, which is neither one-handed or two-handed. It is said to be 1.5-handed since it can be used in one hand, but more effectively in two, as the description for 1.5-handed weapons will say. 1.5-handed weapons suffer a moderate penalty from using shields, and furthermore, the penalty is never completely eliminated, even when you are using a shield. So they can be a good choice, but even though they can be used better without a shield, there's really no reason to use a 1.5-handed weapon by itself for that reason, because the penalties are not really that great, and the weapons themselves are pretty decent. Double-handed weapons are rare. The only double-handed melee weapons are the quarterstaff and the lajatang, which belong to the category of staves. They receive a very large penalty when using shields, which is not completely eliminated even with very high shield skill. For this reason, you should really use double-handed weapons on their own as opposed to with a shield. Furthermore, crossbows, while they can be used with the shield, receive a very large penalty when used with the shield, much like a double-handed weapon would. Two-handed weapons take both hands and cannot be used with the shield at all. However, they tend to have very high base damage and are very useful for that reason. Furthermore, if you're not using a shield, you require far less skill, because that is an entire skill you won't be training as opposed to someone who is using a shield. As a result, two-handed weapons are a very good option, but you really need to make that decision at some point in your career before you've invested too many points in shields if you don't intend on going with shields at all. You also need to note that the handedness of the weapon varies according to the size of the character. Small characters often get bumped up a category for many weapons. What's a one-handed weapon for a medium character might be a 1.5-handed weapon for a small character. Likewise, if a weapon is two-handed for a medium character, that will mean that a small character can't wield it at all. There are also even larger weapons that can only be wielded by large creatures, such as the giant club and the giant spiked club. Weapons also have weighting. It will be stated in the weapon whether they are better for the dexterous or better for the strong. However, this qualification is mostly a holdover from earlier versions of the game. You really shouldn't take it too seriously or consider it too heavily, because it doesn't play that much of a role. Strength and dexterity do play a role in how the weapon is wielded, strength increasing the damage of your weapon, and dexterity increasing the accuracy. But you shouldn't really worry about your strength and dexterity because of the weapon you're wielding. Strength and dexterity do have their importance in the game, but aren't really that important when it comes to weapons, at least not currently, as of the current version. And again, I'm speaking of this for the 0.8 version and early development of the 0.9 version. So in later versions, this may change, but right now, this is the case where strength and dexterity are not really that important, so don't worry about it too much. Weapons also have a damage type. This is probably one of the least important aspects of the weapon. It does have the superficial effect of changing the displayed information when you hit something very hard. For example, a bludgeoning weapon, you might crush a dire elephant like a grape, as opposed to open it like a pillowcase or skewer it like a pig or anything like that. Longswords are, of course, slashing weapons, so they tend to they pick from the list of slashing messages, which is quite cute, but otherwise doesn't have any real impact on the game. There is one exception to this, and that is, of course, hydras. If you attack a hydra with a slashing weapon, you cut off its head, and 2 more will grow in its place. If you happen to attack it with a slashing weapon that is also flaming, you'll cut off its head, but the wound will be cauterized, and it won't grow another head, which can be very useful. But that's about as far as the importance of this goes, so you don't really need to worry about this too much either. Something you do need to worry about is the damage rating. This is one of the very important parts of the weapon, and it decides how effective the weapon is. Weapons with a low damage rating are not very useful at all, especially against opponents with a high AC. If your damage rating is very low, then it's very unlikely that you'll be able to do much damage at all. Your damage rating is multiplied by fighting skill and weapon skill, which means that even a small increase to your damage rating gives you much greater mileage on your fighting and weapon skill. This can mean that even a small increase to damage can result in a very large increase in your damage output. In order for a weapon to be considered good, or an endgame weapon, one that you will use up to and including the end parts of the game, it needs to be either have a very high damage rating or a very low base attack delay, which is the next thing we want to talk about. Again, this is also very important. It's listed here as a percentage value. This percentage value is the percent of a normal action, of the time of a normal action it takes to swing this weapon at an enemy. This means that it will take me 130% of a turn in order to attack an enemy with this falchion. This is important because if you're attacking with a very slow weapon, then your attack speed, you may end up in a situation where you get attacked multiple times by your opponents for each one of your attacks you make. As a result, it can be very dangerous to wield a very slow weapon with which you are not skilled. However, you can decrease the delay of the weapon. The delay of the weapon decreases by 10% for every 2 points in a weapon skill you possess of the weapon that you're wielding. You can reduce this to a minimum of half the weapon's base delay. So for example, this falchion can be reduced to half of 130%, or 65%. However, there are some exceptions to this. One of the exceptions is for exceptionally slow weapons, weapons with a very high base delay. The weapon's base delay is so high that its minimum delay would be higher than 70%. Its minimum delay is instead 70%. As a result, this takes effect for any weapon whose base delay is higher than 140%. However, it does take extra skill to bring it down to its minimum delay. This means that very slow weapons, which tend to have a very high damage rating, take a lot of extra skill before they reach their minimum delay. For example, the Executioner's Axe has a base delay of 200%. If you followed the normal rule, its minimum delay would then be 100%, which is half of 200. However, because that's higher than 70%, the minimum delay is instead 70%. So you can bring its delay all the way down to 70% from 200. This takes 26 skill in axes, quite a big investment, but in many cases well worth it. Some other exceptions include sabers, specifically, which have a base delay of 50%, and quick blades, which have a base delay of 30%. Furthermore, there is an absolute cap of 20% that applies to all weapons after you consider things like haste and berserk. This means that, all things considered, you can never attack more than 5 times in a standard round, which is still quite a lot. In order to achieve this minimum of 20%, you must be either 30% speed before applying haste, or 40% speed before applying berserk. What does this mean for your weapon skill? Well, as you might have noticed, when left on, your weapon skill gets trained very quickly if you're participating in using it. This means it's going to soak up a lot of your XP, which may be better spent somewhere else. How do you know when to stop? Well, as a general rule, weapon skill improves attack, damage, and weapon speed. Fighting skill also improves attack and damage, but not speed. However, it increases your maximum HP. As we saw in the last slide, once a weapon's delay is maximized, additional weapon skill doesn't actually increase the speed of the weapon. This means that the returns on additional weapon skill decreases significantly once the weapon has achieved its minimum delay. As a result, we should turn off the weapon skill once it achieves this delay in favor of training other skills that will give us a far greater return. This will also allow us to train the fighting skill, which increases our total hit points quite a lot. This is slated to change in perhaps the 0.9 version, where fighting may not increase HP or may not even exist at all, but for the time being, it is important to note that fighting is a lot more useful than weapon skill once weapon skill has maximized the speed of the weapon you wish to use. There might be some exceptions to this. If you happen to be playing a race that has extremely good aptitude with the weapon you're trying to use, for example, merfolk have a very exceptionally good aptitude with polearms, and ogres have an exceptionally good aptitude with maces. It may be worthwhile to leave the weapon skill on because it costs very little XP to train it. However, this is likely still a waste even with a good aptitude. So for most cases, I would say once you have trained the weapon to its maximum speed, you should turn it off. This is especially true for short blades. This is because short blades have an exceptionally low damage rating. So once the speed is maximized, your returns from weapon skill are incredibly low. Not only is there not much damage to be multiplied, but furthermore, they already have a very high attack bonus. So the additional attack bonuses from the weapon skill are also not very useful. As a result, short blade skill is one of the least valuable skills in the game. Unarmed combat works a bit differently from other weapons. Fighting skill still works the same. It multiplies the damage and increases the accuracy. Weapon skill also adds to the accuracy and multiplies the damage like before. However, its effect on skill and damage are slightly different. The base delay for unarmed combat is 100%. This is reduced by 10% for every 5 skill, rather than every 2. This results in a minimum of 50% delay at 25 skill. This means that every 5 points are a major breakpoint in how far you should train unarmed combat. Unarmed combat should definitely be turned off once it hits 25. However, some people like to turn it off before that. 15 and 20 points are common breakpoints. It's up to you to decide exactly when you should do this. It depends heavily on what other skills you want to train and how fragile your character currently is. Either way, unarmed combat is a very powerful skill. Why? Because base damage of unarmed combat is equal to 3 plus your unarmed skill. As I mentioned before, even a small increase in your base damage can result in a very large increase in your damage output. Executioner's Axes, for example, one of the highest base damage weapons in the game, only has a base damage of 20. But you can see with unarmed combat, you can easily achieve a base damage of 30 on a regular character at maximum skill. This is a very large amount of base damage. Furthermore, you don't have to worry about finding a good weapon in order to do a lot of damage. You just need to get lots of skill. You also get extra bonuses to your unarmed combat base damage if you happen to have claws. For example, ghouls get a small bonus, and trolls get a very large one. Your auxiliary attacks can also get a bonus from these strange mutations, like having cloven feet or horns. However, auxiliary attacks do not get to add your unarmed combat skill to their base damage. So their base damage is only 3, plus perhaps a small bonus as a result of some sort of strange mutation or body part. For this reason, unarmed combat or auxiliary attacks are very weak. This includes your offhand attack that you do with your second hand. As a result, you should seriously consider using a shield even while in unarmed combat, as unintuitive as this might seem. Unarmed Combat does suffer extra penalties from using heavy armor, however. Though if you have sufficient armor skill, you can still get away with using lighter or mid-range armors. Once you start getting into heavy armors, it can be somewhat difficult, but it can still be quite manageable. Unarmed Combat is also improved as a result of changing your form. Using transmutation magic to give you different forms can greatly influence how much damage you do with Unarmed Combat skill. For example, if you use Dragon form to turn into a dragon, you can get quite a huge amount of base damage. Often this comes at a price of your defensive abilities. However, there is almost no way to get branded unarmed combat attacks. Only a few forms do this, and you cannot brand your hands or your gloves like you would a weapon. We'll get into brands later, but it's important to note that Unarmed Combat's main appeal is its enormous base damage, as well as its ability to ramp up in damage without the use of equipment. Another topic I'd like to cover in this is the question of enchantments and their effect on corrosion. As you know, all weapons come with an enchantment level, listed as 2 numbers with a plus or minus next to them. This represents a bonus to attack and damage. However, you should keep in mind that it is not a flat bonus. Rather, it represents the maximum potential of the weapon to apply change to its attack and damage. So, if a weapon has a plus 5 attack bonus, it can get anywhere from a plus 1 to a plus 5 extra bonus to its attack. Same is true for damage. It does not simply add 5 to all of your damage rolls. This is not how it works. Same applies for the negative direction. For this reason, and because enchantment does not change the base damage of the weapon, enchantment is not extremely effective, but it can be very useful, and there's really no reason to have an unenchanted weapon if you can get an enchanted one. Enchantment also has an effect on the weapons resistant to corrosion. One thing you may not realize is that only the weapon's damage enchantment affects its corrosion resistance. Corrosion does not apply to or is affected by the weapon's attack enchantment. It's only the second one, the damage enchantment, that is considered when doing corrosion, or when corrosion is applied to it. Weapon gains more resistance to corrosion the higher enchantment it has, and gains immunity at levels plus 5 or higher. If a weapon is corroded, it is always the damage enchantment that is reduced. So once again, only the damage enchantment has any effect on corrosion. It's what allows weapons to resist corrosion, and it is what is reduced when a weapon gets corroded. Random artifact weapons and fixed artifact weapons are always immune to corrosion. Likewise, their enchantment levels cannot be changed by scrolls or other mundane means. Let's take a quick moment to talk about racial weapons. Some weapons have a racial flag, either dwarf, elf, or orc. Dwarves sometimes, I believe on a coin flip, deal an extra point of damage with a dwarven weapon. Same with orcs and orcish weapons. This bonus is also much higher if they happen to worship Beog or Beog, however it's pronounced, and have lots of piety with him. Dwarven weapons and armor also resist corrosion more readily. Likewise, elves sometimes get an extra point of accuracy when they wield an elven weapon. An important aspect of the game is slaying. Slaying is something that appears in the forms of rings of slaying, and on certain artifacts. It'll appear as damage plus a number or minus a number, as well as accuracy plus or minus a number. It is displayed often like an enchantment bonus, with attack bonus first, and damage bonus second. However, unlike the enchantment bonus, it increases the base damage values of whatever weapon you wield, including ranged weapons or bare fists, but again, not your auxiliary unarmed attacks. This is extremely valuable and very important if you find it. It can turn something like a dagger into hitting something more like an executioner's axe. Remember, the only reason why the executioner's axe does more damage is because it has a higher base damage, and slaying changes your base damage. This means that slaying is more useful on fast weapons rather than slow weapons, though you'd still want slaying even on a slow weapon. Slaying can be one of the best things you can find, and you should consider yourself very lucky if you happen to find it. Now let's take a few minutes and talk about brands. Weapon brands are very important, and they come in a wide varieties. First, let's talk about the so-called multiplicative brands. These brands function in one unified way in that they multiply the damage you deal after your weapon skill is applied and after your damage is reduced by the enemy's armor class or AC. This means that it comes at the very end of the damage calculation. The most basic of these brands is the Vorpal brand. It increases your damage by 12.5%, works against all monsters and in all circumstances, but its damage bonus is very low. The next most common type are the Flame and Frost brands. They function very similarly, working on fire and cold resistance. They do 25% damage versus any enemy who is not resistant to their type of damage. The bonus is decreased if the enemy is resistant and eliminated if they are immune. These ones also have special effects versus certain types of monsters. For example, the Flame brand, when used on a slashing weapon against a Hydra, will cauterize the Hydra's head upon being chopped off and prevent it from growing any new ones. Very helpful. Frost brands can freeze cold-blooded monsters, for example, reptiles and amphibians, like, say, spiny frogs or snakes. This is very helpful because these types of monsters tend to be very quick and very dangerous. So having a frost brand early on can be very helpful to deal with them. Furthermore, demons are not resistant to frost, so it tends to be, or they tend not to be resistant to frost, so it tends to be one of the better brands if you want to take it on to the later parts of the game. It's one of the very few brands that is useful for the whole of the game. Draining is another useful brand, though not nearly as useful as Flame or Frost, I would say. It has a 2/3 chance of dealing an extra 25% damage to a target. Plus, it also removes a small amount of extra hit points, which is also removed from the monster's maximum hit points. This causes it to be worth less XP when killed, but its XP reduction is only very small. Draining is not one of the more popular brands, and for good reason. Its damage is inconsistent, and it reduces the XP return. It's also quite rare. If you're hit by a draining weapon, you'll lose a bunch of XP if you don't have resistance or immunity to negative energy, plus a bunch of XP from your experience point pool. This would be quite annoying, so keep it from happening. Bear in mind that a draining weapon or a draining hit from an orc will damage your XP pretty much just as well as a draining hit from nearly anything else. So be very careful from that. The next type I'd like to talk about is a weapon of orc slaying. It's very simple. It does an extra 75% damage versus orcs. It's a very big bonus, but it only applies against orcs, which typically aren't too much of a problem, and it's very unlikely that you'll find an orc slaying weapon in time to do the orcish mines, so very rarely used. You'll also get a funny message if you wield an orc slaying weapon when you yourself are an orc. Another type is dragon slaying, very similar to orc slaying, except it applies to dragons, drakes, and draconians. Likewise, if you are a draconian and you wield this weapon, you'll get a funny little message. This is slightly more popular than orc slaying because dragons are more common and are found later on in the game when you probably will have such a weapon, but nevertheless it's not terribly useful and not often used. The last type of multiplicative brand is the Holy brand. Now, this is a very useful brand because it increases damage by 75% against undead, demons, and abominations, which almost totally account for all of the extended endgame monsters, such as in Hell, Pandemonium, the Abyss, and Tomb. This means that holy brands are very prized in the very end parts of the game, or beyond the sort of the extra parts of the game that you can explore. For this, they are very valuable. However, if you happen to be an undead or a demon spawn yourself, you cannot wield a holy weapon, which is unfortunate. Another type of brand are additive brands. These add extra damage that are unrelated to your base damage. So they add your damage, but it really doesn't matter what your weapon's own damage is like. These sort of add it separately and have their own calculation. They're good for weapons with a very high speed but low damage rating. They can sort of support quick weapons, so they tend to be popular on things like whips and short blades, anything that's fast and has weak damage. As a result of this, they don't really rely on weapon skill too much, mostly because their weapons are already very fast, so they don't need much skill to maximize their speed, and because they don't have much damage, so their weapon skill is not very important. First kind I'd like to talk about is the Pain brand. This does extra damage based on your necromancy magic skill. This can be extremely useful, especially if you happen to have a lot of necromancy skill to begin with, but it's completely useless if you don't have any necromancy skill. Exceptionally useful. This is exceptionally useful versus anything that can feel pain, which is most of the game, but not at the late game. Demons and undead do not feel pain and do not suffer any extra damage from a pain brand. The other kind of additive brand is the electric brand, the electricity brand. It does extra electric damage, quite a lot, randomly per attack. I believe the chance is something like 1 in 3, or perhaps less or more, I can't quite remember, but something in that ballpark. It's exceptionally useful versus anything that is not flying. If a monster is flying, the electricity will not work against it. This means that it works against most of the game, especially the early game, but again, not in the late game. Most demons fly, and therefore they are not affected by this brand. However, it can be used against most undead, and in, say, the slime pits. Electric brands also arc when hitting a target in water. This causes all squares adjacent to the target to be charged with electricity if they happen to have water in them, and any monster standing in that water, including you, will suffer a bit of electrical damage. It also causes the attack to make a whole bunch of noise. As much as it may seem like the electric brand does always make noise, it doesn't. Only when attacking a monster that is standing in the water. There's a number of other types of very strange brands that I'd like to talk about. The first one is the Protection brand. This very simply just adds +5 to your AC, is mostly found on melee weapons. This is kind of weak. It's sometimes used by characters who do not necessarily care about combat, but just want the AC bonus. So mostly for casters, though later on they'll probably want to switch to a stave of some kind, an enchanter stave. And there's also an invasion, or evasiveness, I can't remember what it's called, brand, which similarly does +5 to evasion. This tends to appear on ranged weapons. Similarly, it might get a buff like protection, but otherwise these two brands are not too valuable. The next brand is the Vampiric brand. These types of weapons can only be wielded when full, and it reduces you to being satiated. When you attack with this weapon and hit, it sometimes heals you for an amount of HP that is based on your damage. I believe it's a random number between 1 and the damage you've dealt. This can be a problem, though, because it reduces your satiation whenever wielded and can only be wielded when you're full. So if you happen to wield, say, a bludgeoning or a piercing vampiric weapon, you cannot butcher corpses to eat them, because you need to switch your weapon, and then you'll have to eat more food to get full again, and then put the weapon back on, and then you lose the satiation, and so on. So it can be quite a problem, though it may be the case in later versions, such as 0.9, that you no longer need to wield a slashing weapon in order to butcher corpses, so this may not be a problem anymore. The next brand is the Speed brand. Very simply, it allows you to attack twice as fast. Very helpful, very valuable, very prized. If you find a Speed brand, this is almost always the best brand to use in nearly any situation. For this reason, it was recently given a nerf of it now reduces the damage you deal by 10% before the enemy's armor class is applied, in contrast to multiplicative brands, which apply after AC. So this penalty is quite severe, but nevertheless, Speed Brand is quite often the best one to do. In many cases, the Speed Brand easily beats out weapons of higher base damage, simply because it attacks so much faster. The only time it isn't useful is against monsters with exceptionally high AC, in which case you need to deal lots of damage in big hits in order to overcome their armor class. Next brand I'd like to mention is a Venom brand. It's a fairly common brand. It adds poison to its attacks and poisons an enemy every time it hits. This poison stacks upon itself, getting more and more severe every time you hit. It's exceptionally useful versus monsters that like to run away, like animals. You can poison them, and they sort of, once they get down to almost dead, they'll run away like they always do, but because they're poisoned, as they're running away, they'll continue to lose HP and then die. So you don't have to chase them down or shoot things at them or anything like that. Very useful, but if a monster is resistant to poison, which is quite common, doesn't do anything extra, and takes a long time to take effect and loses its effectiveness very quickly as the game progresses. Fortunately, it's pretty common. The next brand is the Anti-Magic brand. This is a more recent addition to the game. It reduces your maximum magic points when wielded, and if you're hit by one, you lose points from your current MP total. If you hit a monster with this, they have a chance to fail whenever they try to cast a spell. This causes them to lose a turn. This works on any monster that has any kind of spell ability, even very strange monsters like demons and orbs of fire, so it can be quite useful. But is completely useless against any monster who does not have spells. So bear that in mind when you're using it. It's a very strange and exotic sort of brand, but is quite interesting nonetheless. Next brand I'd like to talk about is the Distortion brand. You've probably lost a character to one of these. When you strike a monster with it, or you are struck with it, it randomly blinks the target, teleports them, deals a small amount of extra additive damage, or a large amount of extra additive damage, or it banishes them to the abyss. This means you can easily be banished to the abyss by a kobold wielding a distortion weapon. And on the flip side of that, if you banish someone to the abyss, you don't get any XP for killing them, which is quite bad. If you banish uniques to the abyss, you can then go to the abyss and fight them, which is quite helpful. Furthermore, distortion brands cause a teleportation or a translocation miscast when you unwield them. This can result in a bunch of glow, which can give you mutations, deal a bunch of damage to you, confuse you, or cast you into the abyss. This last one is of interest because this is probably going to kill you if you identify a distortion weapon by wielding it. Or alternatively, because you can bring it to Pandemonium. Pandemonium can be very hard to escape from because the exits are very rare. However, you can use a distortion weapon, unwield it, and be cast into the abyss, which is quite a lot easier to get out of. So it can be used as an escape for that, and it's considered an essential part of going to Pandemonium. The next brand I'd like to talk about is the next and final brand is the Chaos brand. This is a very rare brand. It only generates on certain monsters, unique monsters, like Crazy Youth and, Psyche also sometimes gets it, and Sonia. Oh no, Sonia doesn't get this one, never mind. Chaos randomly picks a brand every time it hits and has an effect from that, which can be quite dangerous. Or it can also do a whole slew of other things, like heal you, or berserk you, or paralyze you, or any number of other things. There's very massive list it draws from. It's truly chaotic in that sense. But it can be hard to come by, as I mentioned. Only certain monsters have it in certain forms. Though Zom, the god of chaos, also tends to gift it, which can be quite useful, though I don't really know why you would worship Zom. He's kind of an unpredictable god. Some other things you should probably know about brands is a scroll of vocalization can turn unbranded weapons into vorpal ones, and they can also turn temporary brands from spells permanent. So if you cast a freezing aura spell to brand your regular weapon to a freezing weapon, you can then read a scroll of vorpalization while the brand is still active to turn it into a permanent brand. Your gods can also grant certain brands, and while you cannot change existing brands on a weapon, the gods can. The Shining One can grant a holy brand, and his when he blesses a weapon, it can also change the base weapon in certain instances. I'll get into that later. Kikuba Kudga grants the Pain brand, and Lugonu can grant the Distortion brand. These tend to be all one-shot things, so value them greatly and only put them on a very good weapon. So what category should you choose when making a character and making your way through the game? Well, for the most part, you should choose your category based on whether or not you want to use a shield. Remember that a shield can provide extra defense, but also represents a much larger skill investment. It's a whole extra skill you need to train. Axes are usually the best two-handed choice, given that you can use battle axes and executioner's axes, which are among the best two-handed weapons. Swords can also very rarely be good at this too, depending on if you find the correct weapons. Large creatures can also use giant clubs and the spiked versions of those giant clubs. These are exceptionally good weapons, but again can only be used by large creatures. Maces and long blades tend to be the best for using alongside shields. This isn't to say that other weapon types aren't the best, but they tend to be less precise about it, and on the whole, the best options in the maces and long blades choices tend to be the best weapons in general. Also note that the speed brand is considered very valuable, and only certain weapons can be generated with the speed brand. Short blades can all be generated with the speed brand other than the quick blade. This is because the quick blade would not get any benefit from it. Quarterstaff and Lajatang can also gain the speed brand, making them what would otherwise be an attractive choice quite potentially valuable if one happens to generate. And weapons found on specific monsters called Hell Knights and certain uniques can also generate the speed brand on weapons that otherwise could not get them. Random artifacts can also sometimes have the speed brand on weapon types that otherwise would not be able to acquire them. You can get a random artifact that happens to be an executioner's axe and has the speed brand, but this is the only way to acquire one. This would be an exceptionally good weapon if you happen to get one, but because it's a random artifact, whether or not you should wield it ends up being a bit of, well, it's not always guaranteed, but it's quite likely. Alright, suppose now that you've chosen what category of weapons you're going to use. From this, you can now pick what you think your final weapon is going to be, and by knowing that, you can know when to shut off your weapon skill of that category. Axes have a few options. The broad axe is pretty good if you want to use a shield, but to get the broad axe speed to a more reasonable level takes a lot of skill in addition to the shield skill, so this can be a pretty heavy investment. I would avoid the broad axe unless you're playing a race who uses who has a very good axe aptitude and a very good shield aptitude. If you don't have both of these, going the broad axe route can be expensive. The executioner's axe is the best two-handed weapon in the game for medium creatures, so if you want to go two-handed weapons, executioner's axe is the great option, but if you don't happen to find one of these rather rare axes, you can instead substitute the battle axe, which is still quite good and very common, easy to find in the mid-region of the game. If you choose to go polearms, also a very good choice. Your options are somewhat limited, however. You're going to basically be picking the Demon Trident, or if you happen to worship the Shining One, or plan on worshiping him at some point, you can have your Demon Trident upgraded to a Holy Trishula, which are both excellent for using with the shield. Of course, if you're an evil creature, you cannot use the Holy Trishula, which is always holy branded and is considered a holy weapon, cannot be used by evil types of creatures. Very helpful either way. The two-handed options among polearms are not very attractive. I would stick to the Demon Trident or Holy Trishula if you're going with the polearm, and use a shield when using those. For this reason, the Demon Trident and Holy Trishula and polearms in general are not a good option for small creatures. So I would avoid polearms for the most part for small creatures. They're not exactly the best choice in that regard. That is one time when this weapon type is not very good, but otherwise it's pretty good. Maces are a really solid option in Crawl. The Evening Star is an excellent one-handed weapon that can be used with a shield. It's not half-handed, it's one-handed, which is important. It gets a bit of a damage bonus, but they're also extremely rare, unfortunately. So they can be very hard to come by. You're very unlikely to find one. The Demon Whip is an excellent option for use with the shield. It has a low damage, but it is very fast. And it can also be upgraded to the Holy Scourge by the Shining One. Bear in mind also that holy versions of the demon weapons can also be dropped by devas and angels, though you can defeat one of those. It can be rather difficult to defeat those types of creatures, but a high-level character wouldn't really have much problem with isolated instances of them, though then if you do kill such creatures, the Shining One has a chance to smite you, so be wary of that. In the Maces category, you can also use Giant Clubs and the Spiked version if you are a large character, which have a very, very high base damage and are an excellent option altogether. Short Blades are unique in that they don't get increased in size or handedness if you're a small creature, so they can be quite helpful. Sabers are often the usual choice because they're very common and quite decent on their own. They can come with a good brand. A Saber of Speed is an excellent weapon to have. There's also a random artifact saber called the Captain's Cutlass, which is a Saber of Speed with an inherent slaying bonus added onto it, and it's really pretty much the best short blade you can find. You'd really want to wield that. Short blades tend to benefit from things like pain and electrocution quite a lot, so if you can find those, they're quite helpful. If you don't want to go with the saber route, you might happen to find a quick blade, which can be quite often better, but they're quite rare, and they also do not generate with the speed brand, as I think I mentioned before, because they would not get any benefit from having the speed brand. They are already at the minimum speed quite easily, and they are, as I mentioned before, they are very rare, but they also get very good mileage out of slaying because of their incredible speed. So they can be quite a good option for short blade characters. Long blades are also a very good option. Scimitars are quite alright. They're the best of the common choices, and they can be okay without much skill required. But they only have a base damage of, I believe, 11, which is not, or maybe it was 10, can't remember. Either way, it's not terribly attractive for their speed, so they're not really that good of a weapon altogether, but they can last you quite a while and are pretty easy to find. The Demon Blades are quite a bit better than Scimitar and are reasonably easy to acquire. You can usually expect to get at least a Demon Blade as your final weapon in any particular game, and of course if you worship the Shining One or find a Deva who happens to be wielding one, you can get a U Demon Blade, which is, of course, the wholly improved version, quite a bit better, so that's always nice. There's also very, very, very rare weapons called Double Swords and Triple Swords, which are 1.5-handed, or maybe it's one-handed. Can't quite remember. I think it's 1.5-handed. And triple swords, which are two-handed. These are very good. The triple sword, of course, being two-handed, is pretty much the only really good two-handed option for long blades. The other option being the great sword, which is not very good at all. Double swords are extremely good for use with a shield, but are very hard to find. There's also another weapon type called the katana, which is quite excellent, but it's slated to be removed very soon. If your version happens to have one, then go ahead and use it, but in all probability you won't find one, either because they've been made excessively rare to the point where they can also only be generated in very specific circumstances, or they've just been removed entirely. So don't worry about them too much. Last category are staves. There's a very specific kind of staves called enchanter staves. You've probably seen them before. They're called staff of fire, staff of cold, and so on. These have a very special property. First of all, they're one-handed and, or I believe 1.5-handed. I should really look these up before checking them. But either way, their important quality is that they do extra damage based upon the type that they have. So, for example, the Staff of Fire does extra fire-based damage and so on. This damage is determined by the skill of the appropriate magic school, as well as your skill in evocations. So it can do quite a bit of extra damage and be very useful, and this is sort of a strategy on its own. And additionally, they also tend to give a resistance of some kind. This depends on the staff type. Obviously, with something like Staff of Fire, you gain a point of fire resistance. With the Staff of Enchantments, you gain magic resistance, and so on and so forth. They also grant a casting bonus, so you get a casting enhancer. Your spell power with all spells of that type are increased when you wield an enhancer stave. That is why they are called an enhancer stave. And in general are very useful to casters and usually what they want to wield. The other major option in the staves category are the Lajatang, which aren't a very good category on their own, but can be easily generated with the Speed brand, which makes them quite valuable and easy to use. That's pretty much all of the weapon types as far as melee is concerned. When you're talking about ranged weapons, the choice is much more trivial. You basically just use what the best damage type weapon you have. For bows, you use a longbow. For crossbows, you just use the crossbow, and then for slings, there's only one kind of sling, and so on and so forth. So for ranged weapons, the choice is much more trivial, which is saying a lot given that the melee weapons are already a fairly trivial choice. There's usually only one or two weapons you would choose from. Your choice changes depending on if you're using medium or small creature, but for the most part, you pretty much either just use the next weapon down for large or for two-handed or one-handed use, and otherwise try to avoid categories that don't have good weapon choices for small creatures. So if you were to go through the list, if you were going to use an axe with a small creature, for two-handed you'd be stuck with a broad axe, which is not terribly good for two-handed, but not too bad, I suppose. You'd have the war axe one-handed, which is actually not too bad one-handed. For polearms, you'd be really screwed, I think. I would not really use polearms with a small creature. Maces can be quite good. I would definitely consider using maces. Mace is probably one of the best options for small creatures in that regard. Short blades is the easiest option to take, but sabers and quick blades can be of limited use if you don't find slaying or a good brand. They can be difficult to use, and their usefulness starts to waver in the later parts of the game. As I mentioned, slaying can help this a lot, but otherwise small creatures have a bit of trouble in this regard. You can also cross-train, and I'll get into what cross-training is later after this slide, but you can cross-train into long blades from short blades, which give you quite a few options. The best one-handed option among long blades would be a demon blade, which is quite good You can easily get through the game using that. And as far as staves are concerned, you're pretty much just going to use the enchanter staves as possible, but you can also use the ledge tanks as well quite easily. They don't. The ledge tank is interesting because it does not increase in size if you are a smaller creature, so it can be quite useful. Finally, there's also the case of Spriggans who are considered tiny, and they have an even bigger penalty when using weapons, so they're really left out to pasture on this. You're pretty much stuck with short blades or a very slim selection of long blades. In most cases, you're probably not going to want to start using axes or whatever on a Spriggan. It's not really going to work out all that well. But other than that, those are your options. Pick what you want, pick what group you want, and then see what it is you can get out of that group. The last thing I'd like to talk about is weapon cross-training. Because you can only use one weapon at a time, training multiple weapon skills is pretty much a waste. It doesn't really help you to have a really high X skill if you're only ever using swords. However, it can be sometimes worthwhile to switch weapon categories mid-game or at some point in the game. To encourage this, the cross-training mechanic exists. And this basically allows you to train a new weapon group more quickly if you have a higher skill in a related weapon group. So if you have, say, 15 skill in one group and want to train a second group that has a cross-training relationship with it, then until the new group reaches a skill equal or greater to the first group, it will gain a much quicker. It will level up much more quickly until at least the two groups are become equal. In which case, the relationship reverses, and the first group starts training more quickly because it has a lower skill. The groups are short and long blades, maces and axes, polearms and axes, polearms and staves, maces and staves, and slings and throwing. The most common cross-train technique is to go from short blades into long blades. This happens because many characters like to start with long blades on smaller characters and then switch into long blades later when the low damage on the short blades is really causing them to suffer. However, sometimes you can often switch into other weapon types if you find an exceptional weapon of a different group, such as some kind of incredible random artifact, or perhaps, some kind of very rare base weapon type with a very good brand, or something along those lines, and the current weapon group really isn't giving you much to be happy about. And anyway, I believe that's everything I'd like to cover about weapons. So I hope you found this video useful, even if a bit too verbose. I've covered pretty much all of the basic mechanics of it. I think you should have a good idea of how things work now, and I hope it cleared some things up for you, or perhaps gave you a new insight to help you improve your game. And I'll see you in the next video.